Here is the paradox that the forensic historian records when a single sentence changes everything. The sentence itself is not complicated. It is not a policy announcement, not a legal document, not a diplomatic framework. It is 9 words. We may be better off with no deal. And yet those 9 words, spoken by the President of the United States about the Iran nuclear and ceasefire situation, have just restructured the strategic calculus of every actor in this crisis. Not because they reveal a new policy, but because they reveal the honest absence of one. That is the most dangerous kind of honesty in diplomacy. Not dishonesty, not deception, but the unguarded statement of a position that every sophisticated observer already suspected was true, and that becomes far more consequential the moment it is said out loud. The tide is going out on the diplomatic track in this crisis. The tide going out does not produce a sudden dramatic event. It produces a gradual recession of the water that was covering the rocks, and the rocks that emerge, Iran's unchanged enrichment program, the IRGC's unchanged pressure for military response, China's unchanged incentive to use the crisis for consolidation, the Gulf states' unchanged exposure to a conflict they did not choose, are the same rocks that were always there. What the no-deal sentence does is remove the water that allowed every party to pretend the rocks did not exist. The diplomatic track was the water. Now it is receding. For the finance-minded person watching this, the question is not philosophical.
It is operational. What specifically changes in oil markets, in risk asset pricing, in the Gulf economic architecture, and in the compliance landscape for China-connected trade when the primary actor in the global security system signals comfort with an indefinitely unresolved conflict in the world's most important energy choke point?
Tonight I want to answer that question with forensic precision, using the historical record of no-deal signaling as the guide. I study how diplomatic signals reshape market structures, not just the geopolitics they describe, but the specific financial mechanisms through which geopolitical statements translate into pricing adjustments, risk recalibrations, and structural changes in how capital flows through the affected systems. The 9-word no-deal sentence is the kind of diplomatic signal that the forensic analyst treats with maximum attention, because it is the kind that permanently changes a baseline. Let me show you what that permanent change looks like.
One sentence. Trump's "we may be better off with no deal" is the most honest statement of American Iran policy in years, and the most financially consequential because it converts the war risk premium in global oil markets from a temporary crisis surcharge to a permanent structural feature, restructures the compliance calculus for every financial actor with Gulf exposure, and removes the diplomatic circuit breaker that was the last mechanism capable of compressing the premium before the tide goes out completely. Start with what no deal means operationally, because the coverage treats it as a diplomatic posture without mapping its specific operational content. No deal does not mean no engagement. It does not mean withdrawal from the region.
It means the continuation of the current posture, sanctions maintained, naval presence maintained, maximum pressure architecture maintained, without a defined endpoint, without a negotiating track toward resolution, and without the implicit promise of sanctions relief that gives Iran an economic incentive to restrain its behavior. The specific operational difference between deal-seeking and no-deal posture is in the leverage structure. In a deal-seeking posture, both parties hold leverage that they are implicitly offering to trade. The United States offers sanctions relief in exchange for Iranian nuclear constraints. That offer gives Iran an economic reason to keep the nuclear program below weapons threshold and to avoid military actions that would collapse the diplomatic track. Remove the offer, and you remove the economic incentive for Iranian restraint.
What remains is purely military deterrence, the threat of military consequences, without the economic sweetener that made the diplomatic track function. Military deterrence alone has a documented track record in the Iran case. It did not prevent the 2019 tanker seizures, the Soleimani aftermath, the nuclear program's advance to 60% enrichment, or any of the proxy activations we have documented across this video series. The secondary actors who are most directly affected by the no-deal signal are not Iran's supreme leadership. They have been operating on the assumption that a deal was increasingly unlikely for months. But the Omani back-channel facilitators and the Gulf state intermediaries, whose entire role in this crisis has been premised on the existence of a diplomatic track worth facilitating. If the United States has signaled comfort with no deal, the Omani Channel loses its product.
There is nothing to facilitate if the party that needs to move toward resolution has declared it is comfortable without one. The Gulf state intermediaries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, whose elevated positions we have traced across this series, lose the leverage that came from being the indispensable conduit to a deal. The 9-word sentence is a devaluation event for every diplomatic asset that was priced on the expectation of eventual resolution. Now examine the historical record of no-deal signaling in comparable cases, because the forensic historian's contribution is precisely this: mapping the precedents that tell you whether no-deal signaling produces better outcomes than deal-making, and what the financial consequences have been in each documented case. North Korea, 2019. The Trump administration's walking away from the Hanoi summit, the diplomatic equivalent of a no-deal signal at maximum visibility, produced the following documented sequence of events.
In the 3 months following the Hanoi walkout, North Korean ballistic missile test activity increased substantially. Kim Jong-un announced the suspension of the negotiation track. The war risk premium on South Korean assets increased measurably. No military action occurred. But the nuclear and missile programs that the negotiations were supposed to constrain advanced during the no-deal period, and the subsequent North Korean capability, multiple types of ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, tactical nuclear devices, is substantially more dangerous than the capability that existed when the no-deal signal was sent. The forensic record of the North Korea case is not that the no-deal posture produced a catastrophe. It is that the no-deal posture produced a more dangerous adversary over a multi-year period while avoiding short-term conflict.
Libya, 2011. Not a no-deal signal, but a different kind of relevant precedent. The decision to pursue regime change rather than a negotiated outcome with Gaddafi, who had surrendered his WMD program in 2003 in exchange for normalized relations. The forensic record of that decision's effect on Iranian nuclear calculations is well documented by subsequent Iranian government statements and by IAEA inspection data. Iran's nuclear program advanced more rapidly in the years following Gaddafi's removal than in the years preceding it, precisely because Iranian policymakers drew the lesson that surrendering WMD capability without binding security guarantees produces the outcome Gaddafi experienced. The no-deal signal Trump is now sending about Iran arrives in a context where Iran has already processed the Libya lesson. The signal does not operate in a vacuum.
It operates on a strategic culture that has been specifically calibrated by the memory of what happened to leaders who gave up their deterrence programs. Cuba, the 1960s to 1990s, the United States maintained a maximum pressure posture on Cuba. Embargo, diplomatic isolation, covert operations, for 3 decades without achieving the regime change or significant policy concession that the pressure was supposed to produce. The Castro government survived. The pressure produced economic hardship for the Cuban population without achieving the political outcomes the pressure was designed to produce. The forensic lesson from the Cuba case is that sustained no-deal pressure on a state with sufficient external support, in Cuba's case, Soviet and later Venezuelan support, in Iran's case, Chinese purchase architecture, does not inevitably produce capitulation. It produces adaptation, sometimes over decades.
Now map the financial consequences of no-deal signaling for the specific assets and markets that the finance-minded viewer needs to understand. The mechanism runs through several channels simultaneously. The oil market channel is the most immediate and the most direct. The war risk premium in Brent crude, the spread between what crude would cost in a Hormuz-secure, sanctions-free world and what it costs given the current risk environment, has been a persistent feature of global oil pricing throughout this crisis. We estimated that premium at $3 to $8 per barrel in earlier videos. The no-deal sentence changes the nature of that premium. It converts it from a crisis surcharge, a temporary addition to the price that should compress when the crisis resolves, to a structural feature, a permanent component of the price that reflects an indefinitely unresolved conflict rather than a crisis trending toward resolution.
The market pricing mechanism that converts a crisis surcharge to a structural feature is specific and documentable. Options markets price the future distribution of oil prices. In a crisis trending toward resolution environment, the options skew. The difference in implied volatility between upside and downside price scenarios tilts toward near-term resolution premium. In an indefinite no-resolution environment, the options skew flattens or reverses, because the upside scenario, deal, sanctions relief, normalized Iranian exports, Hormuz security, recedes as a near-term probability. The futures curve steepens in the outer months as the structural premium becomes priced across the full delivery horizon rather than only in near-term contracts. These are not abstract market movements. They translate into higher embedded energy costs across the entire global economy, in aviation fuel, in petrochemical feedstocks, in heating oil, in the energy component of every manufactured good. The risk asset channel operates through a different mechanism but produces related effects. Equity markets with Gulf exposure, Saudi Aramco and its upstream exposure, the UAE's financial sector, the regional logistics companies whose operations depend on stable Gulf security, price geopolitical risk as a discount to their intrinsic value. In a deal-seeking environment, that discount reflects a crisis that might resolve. In a no-deal environment, the discount becomes structural, a permanent reduction in the multiple that investors are willing to pay for assets whose cash flows are exposed to indefinitely unresolved conflict risk. The adjustment is not catastrophic. Markets do not collapse on no-deal signals unless they are accompanied by imminent military action, but it is persistent and compounding. The currency and fixed income channel runs through sovereign debt markets in the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain issue sovereign bonds that are priced on assumptions about fiscal stability, oil revenue predictability, and regional security. A no-deal signal that converts the Gulf security environment from crisis trending toward resolution to indefinitely unresolved raises the risk premium that sovereign debt buyers require. Spreads widen, refinancing costs increase. The fiscal arithmetic for Gulf state budgets that are managing Vision 2030 investment programs and post-oil revenue diversification strategies becomes more constrained. These are not dramatic effects. They are basis point effects that compound over years into meaningful changes in the fiscal capacity of the countries most directly affected. Now map the compliance architecture consequence. The channel that the coverage is not connecting to the no-deal sentence, but that is operationally significant for every financial institution managing China-connected trade exposure after the vessel seizure we covered in the last video. In a deal-seeking environment, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control calibrates its enforcement posture to support the diplomatic track. Enforcement actions are timed to create pressure for negotiation, not to close the space for negotiation. Designations are targeted at entities that can be offered relief in exchange for behavioral change. The entire sanctions architecture is designed as a reversible pressure instrument, something that can be lifted when a deal is reached. In a no-deal environment, the reversibility assumption is removed. Sanctions that were instruments of diplomatic leverage become instruments of permanent pressure, not designed to produce a specific negotiated outcome, but to maximize long-term pain regardless of whether a negotiated outcome is available. That shift changes the OFAC enforcement posture in a specific way. Designations that were previously held in reserve as diplomatic leverage, including the documentation from the Chinese origin vessel seizure, become available for deployment without the constraint of deal track preservation. If there is no deal to protect, there is no reason to hold enforcement actions in reserve. The implication for financial institutions managing China-connected trade exposure is that the no-deal signal significantly increases the probability of the Scenario 2 outcome we mapped in the last video. The documentation chain from the vessel seizure reaches state-adjacent Chinese entities, and OFAC designates those entities because the constraint against designation, protecting the diplomatic track, no longer applies. That is the specific compliance tail risk that the no-deal sentence has just elevated, not immediately, not certainly, but measurably in the probability distribution of outcomes that compliance officers need to be modeling. Now trace the secondary actors who actually move the board in response to no-deal signaling, because they are not the primary actors and not the ones getting coverage, but they are the ones whose responses will determine the actual trajectory of the crisis over the next 6 to 12 months. The IRGC's internal pressure, which we mapped in the context of the marine boarding operation, is directly affected by the no-deal signal. In a deal-seeking environment, the argument for restraint inside the Iranian political system is, do not take actions that collapse the diplomatic track, because the diplomatic track is the path to sanctions relief, and sanctions relief is the path to economic normalization. Remove the diplomatic track, and that argument disappears. The IRGC commanders who have been arguing for a more forceful response to the marine boarding operation lose their most significant constraint when the United States signals comfort with no deal. The Supreme Leadership's ability to argue for continued restraint on the grounds that the diplomatic track is worth protecting is directly degraded by the 9-word sentence. China's free-riding strategy, which we mapped in the context of Beijing using the Gulf crisis as a consolidation opportunity, is also directly affected. In a deal-seeking environment, Beijing has an incentive to be seen as a constructive diplomatic actor, making the Xi Salman call, validating the piracy framing, positioning itself as the mediator between Washington and Tehran. If there is no deal to facilitate, China's role as constructive mediator loses its function. The consolidation strategy does not change, but the specific diplomatic positioning instrument, being seen as the party working toward resolution, loses its utility. China reverts to pure free-rider posture without even the veneer of constructive engagement. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, whose elevated positions we have traced across this series, lose the most from no-deal signaling. Their value in this crisis has been their ability to serve as indispensable intermediaries in a diplomatic process that both Washington and Tehran were theoretically pursuing. If Washington is no longer pursuing a deal, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are intermediaries without a process to intermediate. Their diplomatic leverage, built on being the essential conduit between the two primary parties, is directly devalued by the no-deal sentence. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi will respond to this devaluation by accelerating their own direct engagement with Tehran, hedging against American disengagement from the diplomatic track by building their own bilateral relationships with Iran that do not depend on American participation. The forensic historical record tells us one more thing about no-deal signaling that the coverage has not connected to this specific sentence. No-deal postures have a documented tendency to produce deals, eventually on worse terms than were available when no deal was first signaled. The mechanism is consistent across cases. The party signaling comfort with no deal uses the no-deal posture to extract better terms. The adversary, having correctly assessed that the no-deal signal is genuine in the short term, recalibrates its behavior to demonstrate that the no-deal posture imposes costs on the signaling party as well. The adversary's recalibrated behavior creates pressure on the signaling party's domestic political system and allied relationships. Eventually, the signaling party returns to the table, but the adversary has spent the intervening period advancing the capabilities or positions that the deal was supposed to constrain. The deal that eventually happens is priced at a higher cost to the signaling party than the deal that was available before the no-deal signal. In the Iran case, the documented version of this mechanism runs as follows. The no-deal signal removes the economic incentive for Iranian restraint. Iran advances its nuclear program, activates proxy networks more aggressively, and applies pressure on Gulf state targets in ways that impose economic costs on American allies. Those costs create allied pressure on Washington to return to the negotiating table. Washington returns, but Iran's enrichment program is now at a higher level than when the no-deal signal was sent, and the deal that Iran will accept has higher sanctions relief requirements and fewer constraints on the nuclear program. The tide that went out took the diplomatic foundations with it, and the architecture of a deal built on the post-no-deal seabed is more expensive and less stable than the architecture that was available before. The United States faces the fundamental tension of the no-deal signal. It is simultaneously honest. Trump genuinely may be better off with no deal from the perspective of domestic political palatability and strategically costly. Every adversary that hears it recalibrates its behavior in ways that make the eventual deal more expensive or the eventual conflict more likely. The most honest diplomatic signal is sometimes the most dangerous one. That is the paradox the forensic historian records. Iran faces the mirror image. The no-deal signal removes the economic incentive for restraint, but does not remove the military deterrent for full-scale conflict. Iran must navigate a space in which the carrot of sanctions relief has been removed and the stick of military response remains. In that space, the rational Iranian behavior, based on the forensic record of comparable cases, is to advance the nuclear program, activate proxy networks at higher intensity, and apply pressure that creates costs for American allies without crossing the military threshold that would trigger direct U.S. military response. The no-deal signal does not produce immediate Iranian escalation. It produces a gradual advance of every Iranian capability that the deal was supposed to constrain. The finance-minded actor watching this needs to understand the specific time horizon over which these changes play out. The immediate effect, in the next 30 to 60 days, is a modest widening of the war risk premium in crude pricing, a marginal tightening of sanctions enforcement posture, and the devaluation of Gulf state diplomatic assets. The medium-term effect, in the next 6 to 12 months, is the gradual advancement of Iranian capabilities, the IRGC's recalibrated pressure, and the increasing probability of a proxy escalation that crosses the threshold into direct military engagement. The long-term effect, over years, is the construction of a more dangerous baseline from which any eventual deal must be negotiated, at higher cost and under worse conditions than were available today. Scenario 1. The no-deal signal is a tactic, not a policy. Trump uses the 9-word sentence to extract a specific Iranian concession, a symbolic gesture on enrichment, a prisoner release, a formal back-channel acknowledgement, that allows him to claim a deal is no longer necessary because Iran has already moved. The no-deal signal worked as leverage. The diplomatic track quietly resumes under a different label. The war risk premium compresses. This is the most optimistic interpretation of the sentence and requires Trump's deal-making instinct to be operating precisely and Iran's back channel to be active enough to receive and respond to the signal within a politically viable timeframe. Scenario 2. The no-deal signal is genuine and the diplomatic track closes. OFAC enforcement posture shifts from deal track preserving to maximum pain. The documentation from the Chinese origin vessel seizure is deployed against state-adjacent entities. Iranian proxy activity increases in response to the removal of the economic restraint incentive. Gulf state sovereign spreads widen. Oil prices embed the structural no-deal premium. The Omani back channel goes dormant. The crisis enters the managed indefinite tension phase that is the most common outcome of no-deal postures in comparable cases. This is the most likely scenario. Scenario 3. The no-deal signal triggers the IRGC escalation that the diplomatic track was preventing. Without the economic argument for restraint, the IRGC's pressure for a direct military response to the marine boarding operation succeeds internally. Iran conducts a direct military action against a U.S. asset. The U.S. responds. The Gulf crisis transitions from managed tension to direct conflict. Oil prices spike to levels that produce global economic shock. This scenario has a low probability but is now higher than it was before the 9-word sentence. Scenario 4. The no-deal signal galvanizes Chinese and Saudi diplomatic intervention at a scale that fills the vacuum left by American diplomatic disengagement. Beijing, having heard the no-deal signal and calculated that the resulting instability threatens its energy architecture, uses its 90% purchase leverage over Iran more explicitly than it has previously. Saudi Arabia, having heard the no-deal signal and calculated that its diplomatic value is being devalued, accelerates its own direct engagement with Tehran. The combination of Chinese economic pressure and Saudi diplomatic engagement produces an Iranian behavioral adjustment that makes a deal possible, but on terms that are negotiated by Beijing and Riyadh rather than Washington. America gets the no deal it claimed to be comfortable with, and China and Saudi Arabia get the credit for the resolution. This is the scenario that is most damaging to long-term American diplomatic positioning and most beneficial to the Chinese consolidation strategy we mapped in earlier videos. If you are finance-minded and you are managing exposure to Gulf energy assets, to China-connected trade, or to any risk asset class with Middle Eastern exposure, the operational translation of the no-deal sentence is the following. The war risk premium is now a structural line item in your energy cost model, not a crisis contingency. Model it as a permanent feature until the diplomatic signal changes. The compliance tail risk on China-connected dual-use trade has increased because the OFAC enforcement constraint, deal track preservation, has been explicitly removed by the same signal. Adjust your beneficial ownership verification and documentation chain requirements accordingly. Gulf state sovereign debt spreads will widen modestly and persistently as the no-deal signal removes the resolution premium from regional security risk pricing. These are not catastrophic adjustments. They are recalibrations to a new baseline. The longer-range financial implication is the one that the generational witness who has watched no-deal postures play out before sees most clearly. The eventual deal, if it comes, will be priced at a higher cost than the deal that was available today. The premium the United States will need to offer to get back to the table, the sanctions relief Iran will require after additional years of maximum pressure, and the nuclear constraints that Iran will accept after additional years of enrichment advancement. All of those will be more expensive than their equivalents today. The no-deal signal is not free. Its cost is the compounding price of the deal that eventually replaces it, which will be worse for every party than the deal that was available before the 9 words were spoken. Let me pull this together. Trump said we may be better off with no deal. That is the most honest thing he has said about Iran in years, and the most dangerous. The honesty is in the acknowledgement that the diplomatic track has not produced what it was supposed to produce, and that the administration's patience for the process has limits. The danger is in what the honesty produces, the removal of the economic incentive for Iranian restraint, the devaluation of every diplomatic asset built on the expectation of eventual resolution, the conversion of the war risk premium from a crisis surcharge to a structural feature, and the elevation of every secondary actor whose restraint depended on the existence of a deal worth protecting. The tide is going out. The rocks it exposes are not new.